The late afternoon sun bathed the glass walls of Elysium, the city's most expensive restaurant, in a golden glow. Inside, guests whispered over plates worth more than a week's salary for most people outside. But at the far end of the dining hall, near the marble counter, a young black waiter named Marcus stood completely still, his heart pounding so loudly he could almost hear it echo. Moments earlier, he had noticed something strange. A man, probably in his 60s, sitting alone near the window, struggling to communicate with the staff. His lips moved, his hands gestured, but no one understood. The other waiters snickered, one muttering that people like him should stay home. Marcus's jaw tightened. He could tell immediately the man wasn't drunk or confused. He was deaf, trying desperately to order food in a world that wasn't listening. When Marcus approached, he saw the panic in the man's eyes, the kind that comes from years of being dismissed. And then, in a quiet moment that froze the room, Marcus lifted his hands and began to sign. The old man's eyes widened in disbelief. Relief washed over his face like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time all evening, someone saw him, not his disability. The dining hall went silent, the laughter dying mid-breath. Every gesture Marcus made was precise, graceful, almost poetic, a conversation in complete silence. What no one knew, not even Marcus himself, was that this moment, a simple act of compassion, would change his life forever. Because the man he had just helped wasn't just any customer. He was the father of a billionaire. And within 48 hours, Marcus's name would be known far beyond the walls of that restaurant. Marcus had worked at Elysium for 3 years, long enough to understand that in places like this, appearance was everything. The guests weren't buying food, they were buying prestige. Every smile, every sir and madam was a currency that paid rent. He came from a modest neighborhood on the south side, a place where the buses ran late and dreams often did too. His mother, a retired nurse, used to say, "Son, never let them decide your worth by your uniform." But at Elysium, uniforms were destiny. The darker your skin, the lower your authority. Marcus knew it, felt it, and endured it. He was one of only 2 black employees allowed to serve in the main dining area. Most others worked in the back, dishwashing, cleaning, out of sight. Even his supervisor, Landon, made sure to remind him of boundaries. When Marcus suggested new service ideas or requested fairer shift rotations, Landon's tone would harden. "You're lucky to be here, Marcus. Don't push it." Still, Marcus pushed, quietly, through excellence. He moved with discipline, polished every glass to perfection, memorized customer preferences. But no matter how flawless he was, promotions always passed him by. New white recruits, some with less than 6 months' experience, climbed past him with ease. On that particular evening, Marcus had been running double shifts, covering for a coworker who had called in sick. Exhaustion traced his movements, but he hid it well. The restaurant buzzed with high-profile guests, tech executives, politicians, influencers, the kind of crowd where one mistake could end a career. Then the older man arrived, silver hair, expensive coat, and eyes that seemed gentle yet uncertain. He carried a small notepad and pen, but his handwriting trembled. The hostess led him to a corner table, unaware of his condition. Minutes passed, then frustration. The man gestured awkwardly, trying to explain. A few waiters chuckled under their breath, assuming he was eccentric. Landon smirked. "Handle him, Marcus. You're good with complicated types." The remark stung, but Marcus obeyed. As he approached, he noticed the man's hands forming familiar shapes, fragments of American Sign Language. His brain sparked with recognition. He's deaf. Marcus hadn't used sign language in years, not since he'd learned it in community college while volunteering for hearing-impaired children. Instinct took over. He placed a gentle hand on the table to draw attention, waited until the man's eyes met his, then signed slowly. "Can I help you?" The transformation was instant. Confusion vanished, replaced by gratitude and calm. The man signed back. "Thank you." Nobody understood. Within minutes, Marcus had taken the man's full order, even adjusting it for allergies he communicated through gestures. Around them, diners watched in stunned silence. The same co-workers who had laughed were now frozen. Landon's smirk had evaporated. Marcus served the meal himself, maintaining quiet dignity. The old man smiled throughout, occasionally writing notes for clarification. By the end of the evening, he left a $500 tip and a handwritten message. "In a world that often speaks too loudly, you were the only one who listened." Marcus tucked the note in his pocket, not realizing that the next morning, that very piece of paper would become evidence in a story that the city's media would devour. Because later that night, as the man returned home, his driver, noticing his emotional state, asked what had happened. The man smiled faintly and said, "Kindness still exists. I met someone extraordinary today." The driver didn't realize his employer was Arthur Hale, the father of Ethan Hale, a tech billionaire whose company dominated headlines for its charity work and innovation. By dawn, Ethan Hale would read a message from his father that simply said, "Find this man." He reminded me what humanity sounds like. The next morning began like any other. Marcus woke up before sunrise, pressed his uniform, and caught the first bus downtown. The city was still half asleep, but his mind wasn't. The night replayed itself in pieces, the old man's trembling hands, the quiet gratitude in his eyes, the note folded neatly in his pocket. When Marcus clocked in, Elysium was already vibrating with tension. Something had shifted. Landon was pacing near the bar, his jaw tight, whispering to the hostess and gesturing toward the office. Marcus could sense it. Something big had happened, and not the kind that favored people like him. "Marcus!" Landon called sharply. "Office! Now!" Inside, the air was cold. The restaurant owner, Ms. Covington, sat behind the desk, immaculate in her pearl gray suit. Her voice was clipped and practiced. "Marcus, I've received a complaint about last night. A customer claims you made him uncomfortable by making unsolicited gestures." Marcus blinked. "Gestures?" Landon folded his arms. "You were waving your hands at a guest, right?" People noticed. It looked unprofessional. He realized what they meant. Sign language. Marcus's pulse thudded in disbelief. "He's deaf," he said evenly. He couldn't communicate otherwise. "I was helping." Covington's smile was thin. "That may be true, but appearances matter here. We have an image to maintain. Not everyone understands that sort of behavior." "Behavior?" Marcus repeated. "Helping a man order dinner?" Landon's tone sharpened. "Watch it. You're already under review for missing shifts last month." Marcus felt a familiar burn of injustice rise in his chest, the same one that had followed him through every subtle humiliation, every smirk, every dismissal disguised as policy he wanted to argue, to demand fairness. But he also knew what defiance cost in places like this. He left the office silent, gripping the folded note in his pocket like a lifeline. That evening, word began spreading online. A small restaurant blog had picked up a story titled, "Deaf Man Finds Compassion at Elysium." The article was brief but emotional, apparently written by Arthur Hale's driver, who had recounted the event after overhearing the billionaire's father describe it. Marcus's name wasn't mentioned, but the description. A young black waiter fluent in sign language spread fast. Within hours, hashtags appeared. Hashtag sign of respect, hashtag silent kindness, hashtag Elysium waiter. By the next morning, corporate emails were flying. Ms. Covington's tone had shifted dramatically. Suddenly, she was all smiles, calling Marcus her valued employee. Local journalists requested interviews. Cameras appeared outside the restaurant. For a moment, it looked like the tide had turned. Then, the narrative twisted. An anonymous comment appeared beneath one of the viral posts. Greater than, "Funny how the waiter only helps the rich. Try being black and broke at Elysium. You'll see how they really treat you." More comments followed. A photo of Marcus, taken secretly by a co-worker, circulated with captions implying he was performing for tips. Someone dug up his old Facebook posts, nothing incriminating but enough for trolls to twist into a story about race baiting for attention. Within 24 hours, Marcus went from hero to controversy. When he arrived at work, the smiles were gone again. The same people who had posed for selfies with him the day before now avoided eye contact. Landon leaned close at the staff locker. "Told you, man." Fame doesn't suit everyone. Marcus didn't respond. He'd learned that silence was often his only shield. But silence wasn't protection anymore. That afternoon, 2 corporate auditors arrived, asking questions about protocol violations and improper guest engagement. Landon eagerly handed them reports, fabricated, Marcus suspected, claiming he'd been disruptive and unsanctioned in customer communication. By evening, Miss Covington called him in again. "Marcus," she began, her tone sugary but hollow, "you've put us in a difficult position." There's too much attention. Corporates worried. He understood instantly. They were preparing to cut him loose, to erase the problem before it reached the top. Marcus walked home that night under cold rain, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. His phone buzzed with hundreds of notifications, but he didn't look. He thought of his mother, of all the times she'd told him to hold his head high, to fight with dignity, not anger. But dignity didn't pay rent. Dignity didn't stop them from rewriting truth. What Marcus didn't know was that Arthur Hale had already seen everything: the article, the comments, even the restaurant's quiet attempt to bury the story. The old man's hands shook as he typed a message to his son. "Find him." Before they destroy him, that message reached Ethan Hale, who rarely checked personal correspondence. But this one was different. It came with a scanned image, the handwritten note Marcus had kept, photographed by the restaurant's HR system during the investigation. Ethan recognized his father's handwriting instantly. Within hours, he made calls. The next day, Elysium opened to chaos. 3 black SUVs parked outside before lunch. Men in dark suits entered without warning, carrying legal documents. Miss Covington went pale. The restaurant froze as Ethan Hale himself walked in, calm, immaculate, and unmistakably powerful. "I'm looking for Marcus," he said simply. Landon stammered. "He's, off shift today?" "Then call him," Ethan replied. "Now." When Marcus arrived 30 minutes later, drenched from rain, the entire staff was lined up, whispering. He stepped through the doorway, expecting another accusation. Instead, Ethan Hale extended his hand. "You're the man my father wrote about," Ethan said. "He said you reminded him what decency feels like." "I owe you a debt." Marcus blinked, stunned. "I was just doing my job." Ethan's gaze hardened. "Apparently, not everyone sees it that way." He turned to Miss Covington. "Your establishment accused this man of misconduct. You do understand that's defamation?" Covington's voice trembled. "It was a misunderstanding." "No," Ethan cut her off. "It was racism disguised as procedure." Every word struck like thunder. The staff went silent. Cameras recorded everything. Ethan continued, voice controlled but deadly calm. "My father owns 8% of your holding company. Effective immediately, I'm withdrawing every investment and issuing a public statement about your internal culture." Covington's composure shattered. "Please, Mr. Hale, this isn't necessary." "It's overdue," Ethan replied. Then he turned back to Marcus. "You don't belong here anymore. I have a better offer." That moment hung in the air, raw, unreal, transformative. Marcus wasn't sure if he was awake. For years, he'd fought to be seen, to be respected, to prove himself in a place built to erase him. And now, in front of the very people who had mocked him, the world had turned. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky had begun to clear, thin light slicing through the clouds. But inside Elysium, the reckoning had only begun. The media broke the story that same afternoon. Billionaire's father rescued by black waiter. Restaurant faces discrimination scandal. The internet ignited again. But this time, the outrage was not against Marcus. It was against Elysium. Employees leaked internal emails. Anonymous staff confirmed that management had tried to fire him. Customers posted reviews calling for boycotts. Within 48 hours, Elysium's reputation imploded. Bookings plummeted. Corporate distanced itself. And Marcus? He received an unexpected call. "Mr. Hale would like to meet privately," the assistant said. At that meeting, Ethan revealed what his father had told him, the loneliness of deafness, the power of kindness, and how a single act of empathy had changed his father's view of humanity. Ethan offered Marcus a position at the Hale Foundation, a global non-profit supporting accessibility programs. But before accepting, Marcus did something unexpected. He went back to Elysium one last time, not to gloat, but to retrieve the note that had started it all. It was still in his locker, folded, worn, but intact. He read it once more. Greater than, "In a world that often speaks too loudly, you were the only one who listened." Marcus finally understood its meaning. It wasn't about language. It was about dignity. And for the first time in his life, he realized he'd never needed anyone's permission to speak with his hands. The next week brought more chaos than calm. News channels debated Elysium's downfall like it was a political scandal. Hashtags turned into headlines. Influencers dissected Marcus's story for views. For every person who praised his courage, another twisted the narrative, calling it overblown or a race card stunt. Marcus stayed silent, not out of fear, out of exhaustion. He had declined dozens of interviews, ignoring offers to tell his side. He didn't want to perform his pain for an audience. The truth was simple and ugly enough. One act of humanity had exposed the rot beneath polished manners. When Ethan Hale called again, it wasn't about publicity. "Marcus," he said, "my father wants to meet you personally." Marcus hesitated, then agreed. The meeting took place in a private hospital suite, quiet, white, immaculate. Arthur Hale sat by the window, frail but alert. His eyes brightened when Marcus entered. "You came," Arthur signed slowly, his movement shaky but deliberate. Marcus nodded, signing back. "Of course," Arthur smiled weakly. "They told me what happened after that night. I wish I could say I'm surprised." Marcus didn't respond. He just sat, letting the silence breathe. Arthur continued, voice rasping. "When you spoke to me that night, you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That decency still exists, even when the world tries to bury it. But I also saw the way people looked at you, and it made me realize how little I've done with my power." He turned his gaze toward the skyline. "I built companies that fed this system. I watched it happen and called it business. That ends now." He handed Marcus a folder. Inside were documents bearing the Hale Foundation seal, partnership proposals, budget outlines, signatures. "You'll lead a new branch," Arthur said. "The Elysium Initiative. A program focused on workplace equality and accessibility. Every dollar that once fed that restaurant's name will now fund your cause." Marcus looked up, stunned. "You're naming it after them?" Arthur's eyes glinted. "Yes, because the name won't remind people of luxury anymore. It'll remind them of change." Tears welled in Marcus's eyes, but he blinked them back. "Why me?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Because you didn't ask to be the hero. You just chose not to be silent." The old man's breathing grew shallow. Nurses entered quietly, signaling that the visit should end. Marcus stood, unsure what to say. Arthur raised his trembling hand and signed one last message. "Don't let them take your voice again." That night, Arthur Hale passed away. The news spread within hours, but so did his final act. The Elysium Initiative went public, backed by a $50 million fund and Arthur's recorded statement, a confession of systemic prejudice in elite industries. His speech aired across national networks. Marcus watched from his small apartment, emotionless at first. But when Arthur's words reached the final line, "The man who served me dinner taught me to serve humanity better," something inside him broke loose. For the first time in years, he cried, not from anger, but release. The next day, Marcus stood before a press room filled with cameras, not as a waiter, not as a victim, but as director of the Elysium Initiative. He spoke with calm conviction. "This isn't about revenge, it's about repair. I didn't lose my job because I broke rules. I lost it because some people still can't stand to see kindness coming from a black man's hands. But we're done being silent. We're going to teach the world how to listen." The room fell silent. That was the moment the story stopped being his tragedy and became his revolution. Months passed. The outrage that had once fueled endless debates faded into the background noise of new scandals and viral distractions. But one thing didn't fade: the Elysium Initiative. Under Marcus's direction, it grew from a symbolic project into a national reform network. Restaurants, hotels, and service industries began enrolling in its equity training programs. Companies that had once dismissed discrimination as isolated incidents were now volunteering for audits, and the irony didn't escape anyone. The same kind of corporate audit that had once been used to hide bias was now exposing it. Marcus never sought fame. He refused sponsorship deals and television features. He spent his time traveling to workshops, standing in kitchens, sitting with workers who spoke in broken English or trembling voices. He listened, the same way he had listened to Arthur Hale that night in the restaurant, using silence as a bridge. The world had noticed something rare: a man changing systems not through anger, but through precision. One evening, Marcus returned to the now abandoned site of Elysium. The building stood stripped of luxury. No music, no chandeliers, just echoing walls where whispers of false sophistication once lived. He walked through the dining hall, his footsteps soft on the marble floor. The memory of that night, the humiliation, the courage, the quiet conversation in sign language, came rushing back like air filling an old wound. He paused at the spot where he had first knelt beside Arthur Hale's table. For a moment, it felt like time folded back on itself. The noise, the stares, the weight of every unspoken word. He whispered, "Not for anyone else to hear. Now you can rest. I kept the promise." Outside, city lights shimmered against the glass, cold and bright. As Marcus exited the building, a small group of young waiters stood nearby holding clipboards from the Elysium Initiative. One of them, a black teenager barely out of high school, stopped him. "Sir? Are you Marcus Reed?" Marcus nodded. The boy smiled nervously. "I just wanted to say, your story's why I didn't quit. When customers treat me bad, I think of what you did, and I keep going." Marcus looked at him, silent for a long moment. Then quietly, "Don't just keep going. Change the reason they have to treat you differently." The boy nodded, eyes fierce with new resolve. Marcus walked away, the night wind cold against his skin, but his heart steady. The city hummed, indifferent, vast, and alive. Somewhere within that noise, a movement had begun. The next morning, newspapers carried a small column tucked between business and lifestyle sections. Elysium Initiative expands to 10 states. Over 200 companies certified. No viral fame, no outrage, just quiet progress. Marcus didn't need applause anymore. His victory wasn't in headlines. It was in systems rewritten, policies changed, and the countless invisible lives no longer treated as background noise. Years later, when historians wrote about the case, they described it not as a scandal, but as a turning point. One act of dignity had exposed an empire of hypocrisy, and it all began with a black waiter who spoke to a deaf man when no one else would listen.